He folded the map back into its creased envelope, the edge catching the light like a promise. Outside the dim command tent, rain tapped a steady Morse on the mess tarp. The dispatch had been blunt. The British were in retreat. Their divisions were out of position, their supply lines frayed, their political leaders anxious. He allowed himself a small, private smile. Across the channel, the islanders would buckle. They had done so before, or so the reports said. If the Germans struck with speed and weight, victory would be simple, clean, decisive, the sort of victory the army had trained its imagination for. That scene, a moment of confident expectation in the middle of a campaign, is the key to understanding a recurring pattern in German planning from 1939 into 1941. Many senior German officers and staffs entered operations with a set of assumptions about the British Army, that it was politically constrained, logistically vulnerable, doctrinally cautious, and culturally less willing to accept high casualties for aggressive maneuver. Those assumptions shaped decisions at the operational and strategic levels. They influenced where to commit armored formations, how much to invest in air supremacy, and even which theaters the Wehrmacht considered secondary to the decisive struggle on the continent. But assumptions are fragile things. When a belief is treated as fact, planning becomes brittle. Small surprises at the tactical level cascade into larger errors. In several campaigns, the Germans found themselves surprised, not because the British had become mythical masters of war overnight, but because the reality of British fighting, its resilience, improvisation, and institutional flexibility in certain contexts, did not match the picture that German staffs had painted on their maps. The divergence between expectation and reality cost time, resources, and ultimately strategic options. If this line of inquiry sounds like your kind of history, take a moment to subscribe and stick around. There's more ahead that will complicate what many commanders assumed about the army across the channel. To understand why senior German leaders thought the British Army was likely to break, we need to go back behind the maps to doctrine, organizational culture, and pre-war experience. Military perceptions are built from training manuals, recent victories, institutional biases, and the stories people tell about themselves and their enemies. For the German officer corps in the 1930s, certain narratives gained purchase. One root lay in the memory of the First World War and the interwar years. Germany's military thinkers had, during the 1920s and 30s, refined ideas about maneuver and combined arms into doctrines that prize speed, decisive shock, and decentralized initiative. Terms like Auftragstaktik, mission-oriented command, captured a preference for subordinate commanders exercising judgment within broad intent rather than waiting for orders.
This cultural and doctrinal confidence produced a mindset. If war is decided by rapid operational tempo and bold thrusts, then armies that lacked either the equipment or the institutional appetite for such operations would logically be outmatched. Another influence was the experience of civilian politics and empire. Many German officers perceived the British as an imperial power accustomed to policing colonies rather than conducting decisive continental campaigns. The British Army's global commitments, from India to the Mediterranean, implied to some German observers that resources and attention were divided. The political dimension fed the expectation that British military action was constrained by electoral concerns and public opinion. Hesitant governments might avoid committing the army to costly maneuvers. Whether or not this view captured the complexity of British civil-military relations, it became a convenient filter through which German staff officers interpreted British behavior. Intelligence and the habit of selective reading compounded these impressions. Early German intelligence collected brochures of British defeatism and political debates. Those items were often amplified and read as representative. In the years leading up to war, German war planners watched Britain through a lens sharpened by the fast-moving successes in Poland and France. When an opponent makes a series of cautious choices, withdrawals, consolidations, evacuations, those moves can look to a listener inclined to confirm a hypothesis, like evidence of rot rather than of prudent adaptation. Doctrine matters, too, in a subtler way. The German obsession with the decisive battle encouraged explanations that emphasized enemy weakness. If the correct way to win is to force a decisive engagement, then when an adversary avoided or delayed that engagement, the explanation often devolved into criticism of the enemy's nerve or competence. That interpretive shortcut saved time in planning, but it did not always correspond to reality. Finally, the logistical picture seemed to confirm prejudices. Britain was an island dependent on sea lines, reliant on imports, and necessarily built around a global empire rather than a continental base. From a German perspective, these facts implied vulnerability. supply lines that could be severed, limited armored transport capacity, and an army stretched across too many commitments. Some German staffers therefore concluded that value could be extracted not only from superior maneuver, but from a campaign that targeted British logistical Achilles' heels. When the war began, a handful of episodes appeared to validate those assumptions.
The rapid collapse of Allied resistance in the Low Countries and France in 1940, the sight of British formations withdrawing from positions while the German operational machine roared past them, seemed to confirm that Britain lacked the political will or the fighting capacity to resist effectively on the continent. For German planners watching the maps, the evacuation at Dunkirk, horrifying in its own sense, read in some reports as a British decision to trade material loss for political survival, and admission, by retreat, that Britain's fighting force had limits. Contemporary German staff assessments circulated summaries suggesting the British had chosen to prioritize ships and political continuity over decisive combat. But this early validation set up the central problem. The evidence that confirmed the German view was real, but incomplete. The collapse in 1940 was not only a testimony to British limitations, it was also an outcome of German strengths calibrated for continental war: armor, radios, and a willingness to accept the risks of high-speed encirclement. Seen from the German side, the result was simple. The British were outmaneuvered. That reading made it harder to see the other side of the ledger, the institutional capacities Britain had that would prove more durable than German planners expected. To sketch that other side, it helps to move from the abstract to the granular. Small, vivid scenes in which Britain's actual fighting behavior contradicted the stereotype. The method here is to juxtapose expectations, what commanders predicted would happen, with the sensory reality faced by soldiers and junior officers. The following vignette is multiple reports condensed into a single scene, a composite drawn from a number of after-action summaries and regimental histories. A battalion on a low ridge, the air heavy with dust and the smell of diesel. German artillery thuds in distant rhythm. The battalion commander watches his line through a pair of weathered binoculars. He has been told the British in front of him will fall back under pressure. Scouting reports found gaps to exploit. Radio intercepts suggested a command change. The German plan depends on a quick, evening assault that will rout the defenders and allow motorized units to pour through. What happens instead is less dramatic but more dangerous. The British line does not collapse. Small groups, down to platoon level, hold firing positions with a stubborn, improvisational tenacity that blunts the German advance. Their machine guns are placed in unexpected positions, their mortar fire is heavier than predicted, and when a gap appears, the defenders fill it with the kind of local counterattacks German doctrine had not prioritized. Communications are messy, messages sometimes arrive late, but initiative among NCOs and junior officers keeps the defense coherent.
The result is delay. Not a catastrophic defeat for the Germans, but a delay that breaks rehearsal for the larger plan and forces armored units to pause, realign, and accept a slower tempo. The map that promised a clean corridor now shows a bleeding set of flanks and a timetable slipping away. This composite vignette reveals something crucial. On the ground, British units could display a level of improvisation and resolve that German expectation did not account for. It was not uniform excellence across the entire army, far from it, but enough localized competence in multiple places to alter operational timing. Mission-oriented command in one army confronted mission-critical improvisation in the other. The result was friction. One of the most consequential arenas where German assumptions about the British were tested was the air war over the Channel and southing England. To the German High Command, defeating the Royal Air Force and neutralizing Britain's Navy were logical steps before contemplating any cross-channel invasion or coercion campaign. Early assessments from the Luftwaffe suggested that air superiority could be gained by pounding fighters and their bases. The German doctrine of decisive tactical employment of air power assumed that sustained pressure would break enemy aerial defense capacities. The reality, however, complicated that simple arithmetic. British air defense operated as an integrated system that combined early warning, centralized command for resource allocation, and quick relay of information to fighter squadrons. Radar installations provided early detection. Plotting rooms translated blips into allocations of limited fighter resources. British Fighter Command was not flawless, but it had organizational features and technological tools that multiplied its efficiency. Where German planners expected raw numbers to translate to domination, British dispersal, repair practices, and command integration allowed them to absorb pressure and regenerate capabilities faster than anticipated.
The Battle of Britain, though not an unambiguous German military failure in every tactical sense, demonstrated that Britain's air defense was more resilient and more adaptive than some German expectations had assumed. Another test took shape on the sands and scrub of North Africa. The theater exposed logistical realities in a stark operational form. For the Germans, North Africa presented two tempting conclusions. First, that the British presence there was a lifeline for imperial influence and could be strangled by a focused campaign. Second, that the fluid nature of desert warfare would play to German strengths in maneuver and combined arms tactics. Yet the campaigns in the Western Desert revealed complex interactions between logistics, initiative, and morale.
On the one hand, Britain could mobilize men and material from empire resources, and its ability to use sea lines under Royal Navy protection allowed reinforcement and resupply, albeit with vulnerability to interdiction. On the other hand, the German Africa Corps operated on extended supply lines, brought up across the Mediterranean by Italian shipping and vulnerable to interdiction and weather. In practice, British forces sometimes punched above their apparent weight because of superior supply routing at critical moments, better use of intelligence, and an ability to rotate units out of the line for refit. In short, the simplicity of the island vulnerability narrative broke down when confronted with the operational reality. Supply and initiative, not mere geography, often decided desert outcomes. A third kind of counterexample was the British tendency, in several campaigns, to convert strategic constraints into tactical ingenuity. Units that lacked armored punch or heavy artillery compensated with deception, local counterattacks, night operations, or concentrated use of available firepower. These adaptations were not guaranteed or uniform, but they were frequent enough to disrupt German planners who expected a passive or uniformly cautious opponent. Where German doctrine privileged bold mechanized blows, British units frequently imported asymmetry. They accepted lower tempo in some places and sought to strike in others with disproportionate effect. Why then did German generals persist in their assumptions, even as contrary evidence accumulated? The answer lies in a mixture of institutional momentum and psychological economy. Confirmation bias is a predictable human tendency. When a professional culture produces a plausible narrative, evidence is often sorted to fit it. Senior commanders, particularly those who had enjoyed spectacular success in rapid campaigns, had professional reputations invested in certain kinds of warfare. Admitting that an enemy previously seen as minor possessed operational resilience demanded a revision not only of plans, but of professional self-understanding. Organizational incentives reinforced that inertia. In the German military hierarchy, boldness was rewarded. Cautious or incremental approaches were often criticized as lacking vision. That dynamic discouraged subordinate commanders from issuing warnings that questioned the strategic narrative. Intelligence organizations could and did produce nuanced assessments, but in a culture predisposed to favor decisive solutions, the more cautious voices were sometimes marginalized. Moreover, the availability heuristic, where immediate recent successes loom larger than abstract probabilities, conditioned staffs to overvalue anecdotal success as proof of doctrine. Intelligence failures compounded the problem. Signals intelligence and tactical reconnaissance provided snapshots, but those snapshots were often read through the prevailing interpretive lens.
When intercepted messages suggested British hesitation, planners emphasized them. When reports suggested adaptation and resilience, those messages were sometimes discounted as isolated. Political considerations were also present. The German High Command could assume that Britain's democratic politics would set narrow operating windows, but the same political calculus could also make British governments willing to accept risk to maintain credibility, especially when the survival of the empire or alliance cohesion was perceived at stake. Misreading the political cost-benefit to British leaders skewed German expectations of how far Britain would go to sustain military effort. There is also an element of institutional blindness that grows from success. When a military system produces repeated victories through a particular approach, the German Blitzkrieg model in 1939-40, it naturally gravitates to similar applications. That tendency makes it harder to evaluate the opponent on their own terms rather than as a function of how one expects the opponent to behave. These conceptual pieces, doctrinal confidence, selective intelligence, political caricature, and institutional reward structures, combine to create a robust expectation among many German officers that British resistance would be limited, inconsistent, or easily outmaneuvered. But the narrative of inevitable British collapse rested on unstable ground. Empirical cases that challenged the expectation began to accumulate.
not always as dramatic reversals, but often as a series of frictions that, in aggregation, altered campaign dynamics. To illustrate how these dynamics played out in practice, consider another vignette, this one drawn from a range of regimental accounts and staff summaries and presented as a composite example. Composite vignette, drawn from multiple after-action reports and regimental histories. It is late afternoon in a coastal sector. A British infantry company has just been reinforced with a handful of anti-tank weapons and a few Bren light machine guns. Their commander, a lieutenant, has been briefed to hold as long as possible and to keep lines of retreat open for neighboring units. German reconnaissance reports suggest their position can be enveloped within 12 hours. Staff planners have already scheduled follow-on armored thrusts to break what they believe will be a thin defensive seam. As dusk falls, the company's positions are probed. Artillery fire rarely lands where expected. The defenders have shifted their firing to unobserved positions, creating the impression of stronger numbers. When a gap appears to the northwest, a platoon leader improvises a small counterattack with the anti-tank crew and a squad of riflemen. The counterattack succeeds in blunting the German flank and buying time. Under cover of smoke and the noise of several mortar rounds, engineers move forward and lay an anti-tank obstacle across the road the Germans intended to use.
The armor that the German staff had timed to arrive by midnight finds the route blocked and the village defended. The delay is not decisive in itself, it does not produce a breakthrough, but it costs the Germans roughly 12 critical hours, enough to push operational timelines out of sync with artillery resupply and air support windows. Because the German plan relied on tight sequencing, the delay forces a decision: pause and reorganize, accept higher casualties in a forced assault, or shift to a different sector. Each of those choices imposes cost. In that theater, the local British improvisation degrades a larger operational plan. What the vignette underlines is the value of small-scale initiative and improvisation, qualities that many German planners had underweighted. They could win decisive engagements when the conditions were right, but the accumulation of tactical frictions, delays caused by stubborn defense, obstacles improvised by junior leaders, unexpected counterattacks, could erode the tempo on which German methods depended. As these frictions accumulated across multiple theaters, in the air, along the coasts, in desert tracts, and in marshy Balkan valleys, an unnerving pattern emerged for some German planners. The British Army was not a monolithic, collapse-prone force. It was a mixed instrument that could, under certain pressures, display the kind of resilience and adaptability German doctrine had not primed for. The important point is not that the British were superior in every respect. Rather, they were less predictable and more adaptable in specific, consequential ways than German expectations allowed. This realization did not produce an immediate, uniform revision of German strategy. Instead, it provoked debates and, at times, confusion. Some commanders doubled down on speed and shock, reasoning that if problems persisted, the solution was to apply more force. Others argued for deeper operational pauses, better reconnaissance, and more cautious approaches. Those debates, when they happened, often played out in the shadow of the broader strategic calculation. Germany's central war aim remained a swift decision on the continent. Time was never a neutral variable. As months passed and resources were committed across different fronts, every delay or misallocation bore strategic weight. By the time the first major counterexamples had accumulated, the endurance of Britain's integrated air defense, the stubborn local defenses that slowed mechanized thrusts, and the operational success of British improvisation in supply and tactical adaptation, German planners faced a stark choice: either acknowledge that the enemy was more competent than previously believed and revise doctrine and plans accordingly, or continue to treat those contrary signals as anomalies and accept the risk that aggregate surprise would produce strategic setbacks. The tension between the two paths, revision and denial, is the story of the next stage. Around the Channel, in the deserts of North Africa, and across contested airspace, what began as small tactical frictions would, in certain moments, scale into operational crises. German plans that assumed a brittle British army would sometimes confront an enemy that required prolonged, costly engagements to reduce. The consequences of those clashes would ripple outward, forcing hard decisions in staff rooms and on the desks of leaders who had hoped for certainty. What followed, in choices about where to allocate tanks, how to prioritize air assets, and whether to accept attritional battles in secondary theaters, depended less on abstract assessments and more on the stubborn facts emerging from the front lines. Those facts often spoke in the language of lost hours, stalled advances, and unexpected counterattacks, not the great single battle that doctrine had assumed would settle matters.
The challenge for German generals was to translate a series of local surprises into a coherent strategic response before the compounding effects of delay, diversion, and attrition closed the options entirely. It is here, at the hinge between tactical friction and strategic consequence, that the story becomes urgent. How did German planners respond when their maps were contradicted by the granular reality of combat? Which of their assumptions changed, and which hardened into costly errors? The answers lie in deeper case studies, episodes where expectation met resistance, and the outcome directly reshaped campaigns. Those episodes reveal not only the limits of German preconceptions about the British Army, but also the ways in which institutional culture, intelligence practices, and operational choice interacted to produce winners and losers on the battlefield. The next section will examine 3 of those decisive episodes in detail, one that tested air power and radar-driven defense, another that exposed the strategic limits of supply in a desert war, and a third where a failure to reassess British capacity produced an operational setback with far-reaching implications. Each case will pair a human-centered vignette with the doctrinal and logistical lesson it illuminated, showing how belief and reality collided in ways that mattered for the wider war. The first of those decisive episodes we need to follow through is the one that forced German assumptions about the British into the harshest light, the air war over southern England. The Luftwaffe had been built to break and to press, concentrated formations, massed blows, the kind of air operations meant to shatter an enemy's ability to fight. From the German staff's perspective, once fighter command's numbers and bases were punished, the island's defenses would atrophy. The logic was straightforward and seductive. Remove the RAF as an effective opponent, and Britain becomes coercible short of the full-scale invasion.
What the Germans met over the Channel was not simply a set of individual squadrons fighting on courage and grit. It was a system. Radar stations on the coast turned the English coastline into a network of early warning. Centralized plotting rooms translated those warnings into fighter allocations. Sector controllers vectored squadrons into intercepts with a precision that blurred the line between chance and design. Maintenance and repair practices, dispersal of assets, and the doctrine that placed value on keeping fighters airborne when needed multiplied the RAF's effect beyond raw aircraft counts. In short, British air defense was a marriage of technology, organization, and doctrine that confounded expectations based on single battle logic. To make that point concrete, imagine a composite scene built from squadron diaries and sector reports, a vignette deliberately labeled composite because it draws on many briefings rather than one single source. Composite vignette, based on squadron diaries, sector controller logs, and secondary accounts such as Stephen Bungay's operational analyses. A radar operator at a coastal chain home station sees the familiar sweep swell, a formation of high-flying bombers with escorting fighters. He marks it. The dot turns into a vector. A plotting room in an RAF sector station lights up. Men cross-reference training, fuel states, and the dispositions of squadrons under their command. An exhausted controller, having already sent fighters on 2 scrambles that morning, speaks crisply into the headset and directs 3 squadrons to intercept at a narrow corridor where altitude and sun will favor British pilots. Spitfires climb fast. Hurricanes, already launched, vector into positions to carve the bomber stream into manageable bites. The Luftwaffe's fighter escorts bleed fuel. Some aircraft, hampered by extended ranges at low altitude, are less maneuverable than in earlier engagements. When the German bombers finally reach their targets, they find their targets dispersed, camouflaged, or absent. The British had moved radar, hidden ground installations, and kept airfields partially empty to prevent catastrophic losses. Where the bomber crew had expected minimal resistance, they find concentrated fighter opposition at the crucial point of egress. Some bombers are lost, others limp home. On the ground, repair crews work through the night, spares cannibalized to return machines to flight the next day. This composite underscores a broader operational truth. The Luftwaffe had underestimated the multiplier effect of the RAF's integrated defense and the British capacity to absorb and regenerate losses. Where German doctrine saw air campaigns as a series of blunt, cumulative hits, the British approach incubated resilience through dispersed repair, centralized information, and tactical flexibility.
The German staff's focus on achieving sheer numerical pressure did not account fully for command and control architectures that made a smaller force more effective. Scholars of the period have framed the Battle of Britain as less a single decisive defeat than as the disproof of a simple axiom held by many Luftwaffe planners, that air power, applied relentlessly and at scale, would translate directly into control of the skies. As Richard Overy and Stephen Bungay have shown in different registers, the British combination of early warning radar, efficient fighter direction, and an industrial capacity to replace aircraft and pilots at pace complicated German calculations.
For some German commanders, the lesson was stark. Tactical air superiority, the Luftwaffe's bread and butter, did not automatically produce strategic dominance when the enemy's defensive system turned every interception into a force multiplier. That miscalculation rippled beyond the air war. It altered the calculus of invasion and compelled German planners to reevaluate their assumptions about the conditions under which an amphibious operation might succeed. It also hardened a recurring dynamic we will see elsewhere. German doctrine, predicated on finding and exploiting brittle points in an enemy system, found those brittle points missing or patched by British ingenuity. The second case study takes us to sand, sun, and supply, the deserts of North Africa. Desert warfare laid bare the intimate relationship between logistics and operational possibility, and there German assumptions about British limitations collided with maritime reality and imperial logistics in ways that surprised many observers on both sides. German planning in early desert campaigns often assumed that the British presence in North Africa was a matter of imperial maintenance rather than a force capable of operational innovation. The island narrative whispered that sea lines could be interdicted by submarines and aircraft, and that a concerted effort would strangle British reinforcement. Operationally, the Afrika Korps moved in with a confidence born from mobile warfare, fast advances, coordinated use of armor and close air support, and an expectation that where initiative was taken, the map would open. The reality, however, was messier. Britain's capacity to move men and material down lines of sea with the protection of the Royal Navy, and its ability to use Malta both as a thorn and a shield, created an operational environment in which supply was contestable but never wholly disabled. Intelligence work, convoy maneuvers, and the rotation of units allowed the British to feed and refit at critical moments. Conversely, the Germans operated from much longer, more vulnerable lines. The Axis logistical chain in North Africa depended heavily on maritime left across the central Mediterranean, on Italian ports and railheads, and on the availability of fuel and spare parts shipped across contested waters.
The length and vulnerability of those lines meant that even impressive tactical successes could be undone by shortages. A composite vignette helps to bring this into relief. Composite vignette, synthesized from campaign diaries, convoy reports, and post-campaign analyses such as the British official histories and secondary treatments of Rommel's campaigns. It is dawn in the forward desert outpost. Mechanized columns are rumbled into motion. Trucks chug with cans of fuel strapped to frames, and tank crews check tracks for signs of stress. The Afrika Korps commander watches a flurry of cable traffic, reports of a convoy sighted, a submarine contact, and a late arrival of an artillery battery. He orders a thrust that relies on fuel arriving by midnight. Pushing hard, armored spearheads advance over baked earth and through dust so thick compasses sometimes fail. Night brings bad news. An escorting destroyer reports a submarine contact. Several supply ships are rerouted or delayed. The fuel that was to arrive in the morning will not be there. The lead spearhead, already beyond easy resupply, grinds to a halt. Crews scavenge what they can from disabled trucks, officers ration fuel by the hour. British forces, meanwhile, operating from a shorter supply chain and with naval superiority in the area, are able at key moments to bring forward supplies and to rotate exhausted formations. The next day's planned encirclement cannot be completed. The enemy withdraws, not because he has been routed, but because the logistical clock has run out. The lesson is not that logistics is merely technical detail. It is that logistics shapes the feasible set of military decisions. Desert combat magnified that truth. German commanders who planned high-tempo operations discovered, sometimes painfully, that tempo collapses when fuel and ammunition are missing. British skill in moving enough across the sea at the right time, protecting convoys effectively when resources allowed, and employing intelligence to interdict Axis shipping meant the Desert War was not a simple geometrical problem of who had the better tanks. Historian analyses of the North African campaigns often emphasize the limits of tactical brilliance when supply is at stake. Michael Carver and other chroniclers of the Desert War have argued that Rommel's tactical acumen repeatedly ran aground against a logistical reality he could not fully control. The Germans' expectation that British supply lines could be severed decisively underestimated the Royal Navy and the Allies' ability to concentrate resources where they mattered. That misreading produced a series of operational struggles, repeated pauses to await supplies, hurried thrusts that exhausted units, and an ultimately strategic drain as men and material were siphoned into a theater that should have been secondary. Where the first case, the Battle of Britain, tested German assumptions about technological and organizational resilience, the North African campaign tested assumptions about logistical fragility. In both instances, the British demonstrated an ability to convert apparent constraints into functional strengths, an integrated defense system in the air and maritime logistics and operational rotation in the desert. Those adaptations were not universal nor unbroken. The British also suffered from leadership error, material shortages, and political constraints. But they were sufficient, repeatedly, to complicate the German narrative of easy victory.
The third case study deals with a moment where failure to reassess British capacity had consequences that extended beyond a local theater, the campaign in the Balkans and Greece in 1941, and how decisions about the Mediterranean theater affected the timing and shape of Germany's eastern offensive. This is a politically and historiographically sensitive claim. Historians debate the degree of causality, so the assessment that follows is careful and qualified. In early 1941, the strategic map in southern Europe was fluid. Britain maintained expeditionary forces in Greece and provided a nucleus of resistance that threatened to anchor Allied operations in the eastern Mediterranean. German staff planners, already wary of a British foothold that might cut Axis supply lines or inspire regional resistance, elected to secure the southern flank through an intervention that rolled into Yugoslavia and Greece. The result was a brief but intense campaign that, while tactically successful for German arms, required commitments of troops, equipment, and planning focus. The contentious part of this narrative is the impact that such commitments had on the timing and logistical preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Some historians argue that the diversion of forces southward and the delays imposed on planning and transportation contributed materially to pushing the start of Barbarossa later into the spring of 1941, with consequences for the campaign's progress before the Russian winter. Other scholars qualify that reading, pointing out that the operational timetable for the East was influenced by multiple variables, including weather, the need to secure Romanian oil, and transportation bottlenecks. Because of this debate, the claim must be framed cautiously. German decisions in the Balkans did create additional operational demands that, when combined with a broader underestimation of the Soviet Union's scale and resources, reduced strategic margin for error. To bring this into human terms, imagine a composite scene of staff officers in a forward planning bunker, poring over rail schedules, troop manifests, and fuel allocations.
Composite vignette, synthesized from staff logs, mobilization timetables, and secondary literature debating the timing of Barbarossa. See historiographical treatments by David Stahal and Evan Maudsley for contested interpretations. The operations officer slides another sheet across the map table. Transport requirements to move a panzer division from the Balkans back through Hungary and into railheads serving the Eastern Front. Delicate balances of rolling stock, forward fuel dumps, and maintenance depots crunch against each other. A voice at the table notes the need to secure supply lines in the south, lest a British position in the Mediterranean threaten the corridor. Another voice asks whether a hurried redeployment will leave formations underprepared for the challenges of Russia's vast distances and poor roads. Those are not fanciful choices. They are the choices of staff officers balancing risks on a tight margin. The decision to prioritize action in the south created a set of resource commitments that had to be unwound before a massive eastward offensive could be mounted. For some German commanders, the calculus was simple: leave an insecure southern flank and risk an Allied presence that would pinch resources later. For others, the more dangerous prospect was moving late into Russia and facing weather and logistics that would offset the strengths of German maneuver warfare. The scholarly literature remains divided about the scale of the effect. Some historians argue that the diversion materially delayed Barbarossa's watch and thus compressed the operational season. Others point to long-standing logistical shortcomings and to the colossal underestimates of Soviet industrial mobilization as at least equal factors. What this debate does reveal, however, is an institutional pattern visible across theaters. German planning often treated British threats as either decisive or negligible based on initial prejudice rather than on an ongoing reassessment of evidence. The result was a series of choices that, aggregated across campaigns, narrowed strategic options at critical moments. Across these three case studies, air defense and radar, desert logistics and operational tempo, and the strategic consequences of Mediterranean commitments, a pattern emerges. German assumptions about the British Army's limitations were not uniformly wrong. They were built on observable facts and plausible inferences. But the error lay in generalizing situational strengths and treating contingencies as certainties. The combat phenomena that confounded German expectations were not miraculous. They were often mundane institutional features: a central plotting room, a protected convoy route, an improvised anti-tank obstacle. Those features, repeated across theaters, produced friction that eroded the speed and concentration on which German methods depended. Why did the German officer corps so frequently treat the inconvenient data as noise?
The answer is as much organizational psychology as it is military theory. When a professional culture celebrates a particular approach, mission command, rapid maneuver, shock, then evidence that contradicts that approach often receives less attention than expected. Confirmation bias makes success feel instructive and failure feel exceptional. In a hierarchical war machine where reputation and promotion align with daring and decisive achievement, warnings from cautious subordinates can be risky to voice. Even when voiced, they may be marginalized. Intelligence practices also contributed. Intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and human reports produced data that had to be interpreted. In many cases, German intelligence read British maneuvers as signs of weakness. Withdrawal was interpreted as defeat, rearguard action as flight. Intelligence collection tools were not defective per se, but the interpretive frameworks applied to their outputs were. Where analysts on the German side saw retreat as evidence of collapse, a more nuanced reading would have read the same movement as cohesion under pressure, deliberate trade-offs, or deception. Equally important was the role of political calculation. German political leaders and many in the high command assumed that Britain's democratic institutions and imperial commitments made its governments risk-averse and therefore prone to strategic timidity. That assumption ignored the ways in which political calculation could also force a government to accept risk to preserve credibility, alliances, and imperial interests. When Britain made choices that looked through German eyes inconsistent, evacuating material in one theater while committing to fight in another, the Germans sometimes read those choices as signs of weakness rather than as complex strategic trade-offs. The net effect of these cognitive and institutional dynamics was significant. Tactical frictions, small pockets of stubborn defense, logistics delays, integrated defensive systems multiplied into operational headaches. German staffs accustomed to timing their operations to hours found themselves losing those hours to improvisation and delay. The cumulative effect of dozens of such delays is not merely descriptive, it is strategic. An army that cannot concentrate mass at the decisive point because its tempo is constantly eroded is an army whose strategic options narrow. In the war Germany waged, that narrowing had consequences. To make the consequence explicit, misjudging the British army led to operational choices that either squandered German advantages or drew German resources away from decisive axes. In North Africa, the commitment to sustain a campaign in the Mediterranean bled supplies that might otherwise have bolstered continental operations. Over the Channel, the failure to achieve air superiority made invasion unfeasible and required long-term investment in campaigns elsewhere.
In the Balkans, decisions to secure southern flanks introduced delays that, combined with other factors, compressed the operational season in the east. In short, the misreading of British capabilities helped create the conditions in which German strategic flexibility was steadily consumed. That is not to argue that the British were invulnerable or that German misjudgment was the single decisive cause of failure. The war's outcome depended on industrial capacity, coalition dynamics, the scale of the Soviet mobilization, and the cumulative attrition of men and materiel. What the evidence suggests is narrower and more precise. Many German generals brought to their planning a set of assumptions about the British that were partly true, partly outdated, and too often unchallenged. These assumptions produced brittle plans that were vulnerable to the kinds of local ingenuity and systemic resilience that the British displayed in several theaters. There were German officers who recognized the problem. After-action assessments from certain staffs, memoirs written under less politicized circumstances, and some post-war analyses acknowledged that British adaptability and the resilience of British systems had been underestimated. But institutional learning is slow, and under the pressure of a multi-front war, the need to make fast decisions often trumped the need to revise foundational assumptions. In many cases, adaptations, more cautious timetables, greater emphasis on reconnaissance, adjusted supply priorities, arrived only after costs had been paid in time and blood. For historians and students of strategy, the larger lesson is not a moral about competence on one side or another. It is a caution about how belief shapes action. Military organizations, like other large institutions, build mental maps of the world that serve as the scaffolding for decisions. Those mental maps are useful shortcuts. They help staffs make rapid calls. But when they ossify, they become vulnerabilities. The German experience with the British Army during 1939-1942 is a study in the dangers of mistaken generalization, treating a set of plausible, context-bound observations as universal truths, and then organizing an entire war around those perceived certainties. There are human chapters embedded in this institutional story. Lieutenants improvising an anti-tank defense that delays an armored column long enough to save a flank. Squadron controllers vectoring fighters into the precise point where the enemy bomber will be most vulnerable. Convoy commanders calculating whether to risk night transit under threat of submarine attack to deliver fuel that will enable a counterattack. Those acts of adaptation, individually modest, aggregated into outcomes that the German staff had not fully accounted for.
The contrast between doctrine and practice, between a clean, map-driven operational plan and the messy reality of soldiers, sailors, and aircrew making decisions under fire, is where the most instructive lessons lie. As the war turned and Germany's strategic space contracted, the cost of earlier misjudgments became clearer.
Opportunities to exploit initial advantages narrowed. Attritional fights replaced hopes of quick victories. Campaigns in peripheral theaters sapped resources needed elsewhere. German generals who had once predicted British collapse found themselves stretched thin, forced to choose between competing urgencies, and in some cases to explain how plans based on brittle assumptions had failed. So, what did German generals really think about the British Army? The best answer is nuanced. Many senior officers entered the war with a prevailing expectation, shaped by doctrine, past triumphs, and cultural stereotyping, that Britain would be politically and militarily constrained in ways that made decisive German action likely. But that expectation was neither universal nor unexamined. As evidence accumulated, some commanders revised assessments, others reaffirmed faith in speed and shock. The critical point is that across the German decision-making apparatus, the predisposition to see the British as limited often outweighed the inconvenient data pointing to British adaptability. Where that predisposition held sway, operational plans proved brittle. Where commanders took the trouble to interrogate their assumptions and to adapt to the small, fractious realities of combat, German operations performed better, though rarely enough to produce strategic advantage. For strategic thinkers today, the story offers a couple of persistent warnings. First, never mistake an opponent's limited resources for permanent strategic frailty. Constraints can be temporary, and judicious strategy can convert apparent weaknesses into resilient, asymmetric strengths. Second, institutional success breeds interpretive laziness. Professional cultures that reward a single kind of brilliance risk discounting variants of competence appearing in other militaries or contexts. Finally, the tactical is strategic. Local initiative, timely repairs, and clever interdiction, things that seem small on a map, can add up into operational effects that alter campaigns. Military planners who ignore the accumulation of friction do so at their peril. In the shadow of those warnings, we can close with a compact synthesis. Many German generals entered the Second World War with a coherent, confident model of how to break Britain, achieve air superiority, sever sea lines, and apply concentrated armored force at decisive points. That model was not wrong in the abstract. It was a plausible route to victory under a set of assumptions. But the assumptions were partial and, in important ways, brittle.
British resilience manifest in an integrated air defense network, in maritime logistics buttressed by naval power and colonial resources, and in frequent tactical improvisations, presented a persistent, diffuse resistance that German doctrine had not fully internalized. The result was not a single catastrophic error, but a succession of frictions that consumed time and resources, and which, in the aggregate, helped shape a strategic momentum unfavorable to Germany. For those who study battle and command, this is less a story of heroism or villainy, and more a study in the limits of predictive confidence. Commanders make the best calls they can with the information and culture they have. Sometimes those calls are vindicated, sometimes they are confounded. The German experience against the British Army is a reminder that adaptability, information integration, and the humble accumulation of small advantages can be as decisive as any grand tactic. If this exploration raised questions you'd like us to dig into, whether about specific campaigns, the debates among historians over the Balkans' impact on Barbarossa, or the technical details of radar and fighter direction, tell us in the comments which episode you want unpacked next. And if you found this deep dive useful, subscribe for more historical investigations where micro-vignettes meet strategic consequence. Thank you for watching. Tell us, which commander surprised you most in this story? Was it a German officer who eventually recognized British resilience, or a British NCO whose improvisation changed a battle? Share your pick below, and we'll explore it in the next episode.